Hello, I'm Dominic Hobson, co-founder of Future of Finance. My guest today is Vadim Sobolevski, co-founder of FutureFlow, a private company whose services use data to address financial crime and make economic policy more effective. Prior to starting FutureFlow, Vadim worked in fixed income at Barclays Capital and in asset management, most recently as a portfolio manager at the hedge fund Finisterre Capital in London. Vadim, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I've already said quite a bit about you, but do tell us a bit more about yourself first. How did you come to be running Finisterre Capital, running FutureFlow?
Yes, sure. So we started FutureFlow about 6 years ago at this stage, and it was actually quite accidental. I started working on the idea behind FutureFlow, which had been sort of lurking somewhere in the back of my head for quite a few years prior to that. And I started actually putting pen to paper while I was looking for a job. I was in a transition period between jobs, and I thought that, well, that was a great time to actually crystallize some of the thinking that I've had behind what eventually became FutureFlow. And so it was really just a fun research project, which I didn't expect to lead to a company creation, but it became so fascinating and so interesting. And I think it was quite topical for the time, considering that it was in 2016. That I started spending more and more time thinking about it and actually designing the concept around it, that at some point I decided to start a company. And my co-founder Xavier, whom I had known for many years from my previous job, was a great supporter of the idea. He's obviously a very clever guy. I always valued his opinions, and we bounced back and forth quite a few ideas while we were working. So we decided that that's really what we should be doing. So before we knew it, we started a company, and for quite some time it was almost like a research effort. It was a very conceptual sort of thinking process where we were engaging with the banking system, engaging with various regulators that we knew at the time, trying to figure out where there's an application for our idea, what part of our idea sticks, what part doesn't, and that's really how it started back in 2016.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've kind of begun to answer this question, but there is a reason your business is called FutureFlow, and that's that the flows between entities are more interesting than the entities themselves. So when exactly did this possibility of exploiting that opportunity first occur to you?
Yes, so I started thinking about this first many years ago. It must have been around 2009, 2010. It was kind of at the depth of the global financial crisis that we had back in 2008. I was a fresh MBA graduate, or a recent MBA graduate at the time. I was in between jobs, I believe. And one day I remember riding a subway in New York and thinking about my current financial situation at the time. And I thought, it's really interesting that the money that I had in my bank account at the time had quite random sources. Some of it came from, a consulting gig that I was doing at the time. Some of it came from, my wife, who might have been working somewhere. Basically, it had lots of, sort of random connections there. And I thought that all stops with my bank account. When I go around and I spend my money, none of that information is available. And of course, that's by design. But what I started thinking about is that knowing what sort of linkages exist in an economy based on this flow of funds is actually a very valuable thing to have. And it potentially is something that makes the flow of funds as such very interesting from an analytical point of view, and potentially makes the principals, the entities who spend money in transactions, a lot less relevant, let's put it this way. So the way I was imagining it at the time is that let's say if I walk into a store and I want to buy a t-shirt, and I pay with my debit card for the t-shirt, or let's say I give them a $20 bill to pay for the t-shirt, the business doesn't really know anything about the money that it receives. It's not really curious or interested in the money that it receives. It's interested in me. It tries to understand who I am. It tries to, usually when you go, a lot of times you go to a store, people ask for your postcode or your age. They kind of try to look at you to figure out what is our consumer like, right? What is their demographics? What is their sort of where do they live, in what postcode, etc., trying to understand what is the profile of their typical customer. But when I'm buying that t-shirt, I'm giving them money, whether it's cash or whether it's money from my bank account. And that money has a lot of information, traces of information they're very valuable as well, theoretically, but that's not really known. And I thought if it were known, then we would know a lot more about the economy. We would know a lot more about what's happening in the economic system without really trying to understand the principles. And so it ultimately came down to understanding the flow of funds. And this is why, very casually, when I thought about that idea, I started thinking about flow, stock versus flow. So flow, and of course that's how we think about flow in the future. So this is how the concept of future flow came to my mind. And when many years later we started the company, we didn't really want to spend too much time thinking about how to name it. And I said, well, when I started thinking about this, I used to think of it as future flow. Should we just call the company that? And that's how it started.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about the other half of your business, if you like, which is central bank digital currencies. And whether digital IDs are a good way into this topic or not, I don't know, but certainly personal privacy has come up in the context of central bank digital currency. Do we want the central bank looking at all our transactions, which might be one outcome of a particular CBDC design? Do you think that, and this is a more general question, I suppose, do you think that privacy and confidentiality are potential obstacles to the implementation of a CBDC in a liberal democracy, when we see what's happening in China already? But is it a kind of showstopper for CBDCs in other markets?
No, I don't think it's a showstopper. And this really goes back to what we were discussing a few moments ago when we were talking about the GDPR, and we're talking about sharing data across financial institutions. As I said back then, GDPR, it really makes this conversation easier because it creates clarity around the concept of what's possible, what's allowed and what's not allowed. A lot of times when you hear these discussions about a central bank looking at our transactions, people don't appreciate the fact that the GDPR really helps it to be clear what is allowed and what's not allowed. Okay, so in other words, the central bank can only be looking at our transactions. Let's simplify the conversation. Let's talk about a specific central bank just to make it easier, right? So let's talk about Bank of England, for example, since we're here in the UK. So the UK is subject to an equivalent, of the GDPR, right? So the only way in which Bank of England could be looking at our transactions is, one, if it were to deliberately break the law, knowingly and deliberately break the law, or if it were to inadvertently break the law, right? As in, there could be some rogue actor that somehow does something that the central bank is unaware of. So I don't believe that an institution like Bank of England would ever be deliberately breaking the law. I think that doesn't make any sense. And I think systems can be designed where rogue actors can be prevented from doing that. So I think that this concern, if you will, is overdone. So I think that in a liberal democracy, as you mentioned, so again, let's talk about the UK, for instance, let's talk about Bank of England trying to implement CBDC. I think the discussion with the population will be quite clear, right? That contract, if you will, between the government institutions and the central bank and the population will be quite clear in terms of what the central bank will and will not do with the data. And the data protection legislation in this country will make it very clear that that's what the central bank will or will not do. Now, here, this is something that came up very clearly in the House of Lords report on CBDC that came out a few months ago. I think that report was quite clever in highlighting the fact that it's not really the risk of Bank of England spying on individuals, but rather the perceived risk of them ever doing that is the problem, right? So in other words, it's no matter how, I guess the report's angle is that no matter how much Bank of England will be telling us that they're not doing it, it's really the problem that people just wouldn't believe them, right? And here, I think that the Lords were quite right to highlight that as a potential problem, but I don't think it's a true problem. It's just a perceived problem. Now, if we go away from the conceptual conversation and towards like hardcore data structures, if you will. And again, this is something that we're working on. In our data architecture, the part of the overall data universe that the central bank sees, right? So in other words, the central ledger that the central bank operates in this classical, or I shouldn't say classical, but in this typical two-tier CBDC architecture, which most Western central banks are considering, Bank of England included, that central ledger does not contain, or does not have to contain, personally identifying information. So again, going back to the beginning of the conversation on FutureFlow, when I was saying that in our philosophy, the flow of funds is orthogonal to the principles, right? So in other words, it can be thought of and it can be analyzed independently of any of the entities through which that flow passes. And so in our architecture, that actual central ledger, which the central bank controls, does not contain the information on the entities. And the reason why, by the way, excuse me, the reason why that's possible is that in this typical two-tier architecture, which is contemplated in countries like the UK, the central bank only operates the central ledger, and the private institutions actually hold the relationship with the customer. And so it really becomes the question of system architecture, whether or not the identifying customer information needs to be passed from that second tier, from the private institutions that are facing the customer, towards the central ledger, where the central bank simply clears the funds from one account to another, right? So from our perspective, there's really no technological problem here, and there's no regulatory or legislative problem here. But I sympathize with the views, like the views of the House of Lords report, that there's really a perceived problem of the Big Brother, etc.
Right. So it's perfectly possible to describe or design a CBDC which doesn't breach personal or civil liberty. You made that clear. Indeed, the usual two-tier model deals with that very satisfactorily. But I'd like to come now to your more radical views about how a CBDC could use. And in my reading, there's two of them, and I'll come to the second one in a minute. But the first one is really to take quantitative easing, very topical subject right now, a stage further and enable central banks to start influencing broader economic conditions directly by using fund flow data to lend, i.e. to create credit, issuing loans and bonds that are then carried on the central bank balance sheet. This is where monetary policy and fiscal policy start to shade into each other, if you like. So can that be done, this radical proposition you put forward, can it actually be done without compromising the political independence of the central bank?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for that description. I think it's mostly accurate,
Okay.
with one tiny caveat, is that I would describe it as not taking quantitative easing further. I would describe it as taking quantitative easing back. Right? So in other words, really shrinking down the need for massive quantitative easing. Well, I guess we can't do it in hindsight because a decade of it has already been done. And in some countries, 3 decades of it has already been done. But at least going forward, it's really something that takes that massive amount of unnecessary stimulus down and scales it down, as opposed to scaling it further. But yeah, so going back to your description, in our view of potential CBDC architecture and CBDC use cases, the policy innovation, if you will, around all of this, rather than the technology innovation, is that a CBDC is something that allows the central bank to turn a portion of its balance sheet into a platform on which credit can be created with the participation of quasi-sovereign fiscal level institutions. Now, going back, so to put it very simply, what this is, and to contrast it with the typical CBDC proposals that are floating around policy circles right now, and I'm talking about retail CBDC specifically. So in a typical neutral, if you will, CBDC proposal or design, CBDC is something that is simply being taken away from the existing commercial banking system and brought back to the central bank's balance sheet, right? So in other words, let's say individuals like you and me who have some money at private banks, be it Barclays or HSBC, etc., may choose to hold a portion of our funds at the central bank itself, right? And that basically creates a CBDC, right? So in other words, I have an account at Barclays. I may choose to take, £100 from that account and put it into my account at Bank of England directly. So that's your typical vanilla, if you will, retail CBDC, which is something that I call neutral, right? Because essentially it's a zero-sum game between the private banking system and the central bank. And it's also neutral in the sense that I, as a consumer, and we, individually, and we at aggregate as a society, really feel no difference between having a CBDC and not having a CBDC, right? It doesn't matter to me. If I go to Tesco to buy milk, I really don't care whether I pay with my CBDC card or with my Barclays card, right? It's the same thing. That's how the CBDC typically is being perceived right now. In our architecture, which I would label as an alternative to this, CBDC is not a neutral instrument, both in the sense that it's something that results from additional credit creation rather than simply from transferring some of the liquidity from the private banking system to the central bank's balance sheet. So it's something where the credit is created. So in other words, it's new money being created on top of the central bank's balance sheet. And we can go at length describing how exactly that works. And so in that respect, it's not neutral. It's additional money that is being created in the system. But also it's something that is not neutral in the sense that it's money that is potentially used for other use cases other than simply transacting from our mundane daily needs, such as buying milk at Tesco. And what we have in mind here is the ability of private institutions, large or medium-sized corporations, to issue, to essentially fund themselves on top of the central bank's balance sheet with the help of quasi-sovereign institutions performing the word escapes me, performing credit improvement, right? So in other words, the assets that are backing the liability section of the central bank balance sheet needs to be of highest quality, and for that reason, they need to be basically sovereign or quasi-sovereign. So credit enhancement is the word I was looking for.
Yes.
So quasi-sovereign institutions providing credit enhancement. So let's imagine an institution like BP, for example. Right now it's very fashionable to talk about green bonds, right? So even the UK itself at the country level has issued several green bonds. What exactly that means, nobody knows. What does it mean that the UK has issued a green bond? Do you know?
I'll get back to you on that.
Okay, all right. So this is not a hypothetical, by the way. So the UK has a few green bonds outstanding. If you ask me, I don't know either, right? Supposedly it's a bond whose proceeds will be used for green purposes. So let's imagine they can buy a green, drilling well, whatever that means. Now, what happens once the money goes to the company that has sold the green drilling well? We don't know. They might as well buy real estate in central London, right? That's very hard to tell. So what we have in mind is that institutions, or the government for that matter, can, for example, issue purpose-driven, for example, green bonds on top of the central bank balance sheet, credit enhancement being provided by a quasi-sovereign institution, and we can talk about what that could be. And this way, the money that is being created, and that money is CBDC, can be used for very specific purposes. And by relying on very specific technological features with which we're enabling that money can be serving those purposes for quite some time, for a lot longer than it can do otherwise. Now here, of course, the big question becomes is what you posed at the very beginning of your question, which is that can we somehow do that while maintaining the political independence of the central bank? And this is the great misunderstanding, because in this whole picture, the central bank actually plays no role other than providing the platform itself, right? So in other words, it's not FutureFlow knocking on the door of the central bank and asking them to monetize £1 million in FutureFlow's little bond that will be used for whatever purpose, right? It's really private institutions working in concert with public institutions, working out what sort of overall direction the economic policy of this country needs to take. And then once that's worked out, simply using the central bank and its balance sheet as a platform on which that money can be created and monetized. So in that respect, I really don't see a way in which the central bank gets politicized. The central bank is simply a technocratic institution serving the overall policy direction set by the institutions that are meant to set it.
On that green bond issue, HSBC published a very interesting report a year or two back, pointing out that the data you need to collect to check that a bond is genuinely green, i.e. the process of being applied for some green investment purpose, drives up the issuance cost very considerably. I think the figure they had was 6% of the value of the money raised, as opposed to the usual 50, 75 basis points you might be, or maybe top end 150 basis points you might be paying. So it's a massive, maybe even as much as 4 or 5 times cost to check that a bond issue is actually genuinely green. Anyway, that's a whole topic on itself. My question still is: you talked about credit enhancement. You talked about the role the central bank can play, but who's actually taking the lending decisions? Is it going to be the central bank, or is it going to be the government, or is it going to be third parties, someone else?
Well, here we need to separate the lending decision and the borrowing initiative, right? So in other words, the borrowing initiative always comes from the private sector, right? So if BP wants to issue a green bond that will only be used for green purposes, not just by themselves, but also by the recipient of the funds many steps down the road, that's ultimately the decision of a private entity, right? Now, if it's something that will be put on the balance sheet, on the asset side of the balance sheet of the central bank, it's something that needs to have pristine credit quality, and therefore it needs to be enhanced by a quasi-sovereign institution, whether it's the country's export-import bank or the development bank or the HM Treasury directly, that can be designed. So the credit enhancement decision needs to be taken by that level of institution. And so the lending decision per se happens, or the credit enhancement decision, conceptually speaking, happens on that side. So as I said, the central bank here doesn't necessarily play a role. So this is a typical public-private partnership, if you will, in which the country, broadly speaking, country-level institutions determine the direction in which some of these priority sectors of the economy can take, and the central bank simply providing the means for this to happen. Now, by the way, this doesn't mean that purely private areas of activity somehow dry out or become unavailable, right? Let's not forget about the entire existing banking system and the entire existing financial system, which continues to serve business as usual, right? Here we're talking about a supplement on top of all of this that is that exists in addition to everything else that we have in the economy. So that's why, a lot of times people can take a very radical view on this in terms of the potential implications and the role in which the government can take in the private economy, etc. Let's not forget that this is just a supplement to everything else that is happening in the economy.
Now, there's some fairly predictable criticisms that this proposal will face. You've talked, for example, about credit enhancement. People are going to say, oh, well, loans backed by the central bank are going to enjoy a premium price. Are they going to pay a lower rate of interest than the commercial banks? I've heard what you just said about this is not about displacing commercial banks, this is about supplementing it. So what's your answer to that predictable criticism that loans backed by the central bank are going to pay less interest than those which are issued on normal commercial terms?
Okay, well, so first of all, let's not forget it's not backed by the central bank, right? It's backed by, let's call it HM Treasury, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, that already happens, right? I mean, you always have kind of parallel markets, right? You can take a regular mortgage, or you can take a mortgage through the Help to Buy scheme, right? There's a very simple example, right? There's always some sort of incentives that are present in various sectors of the economy. And there's nothing unusual about that. This is just one of them. And whether the rate of interest on this particular credit creation will be different from the traditional, if you will, sector of the economy, perhaps. But if anything, that exactly creates those incentives to steer the economic activity in a particular direction. So again, let's bring this a little bit closer to reality. Was it last year? So this time last year, Bank of England was tasked with a new mandate. I don't know if you heard this, but so a traditional developed country central bank usually has a dual mandate, right? It's to maintain price stability and to maintain full employment, right? So they have to sort of maintain the broad economic growth and at the same time not let the inflation rate run too high. We're not going to comment on how well they're doing on that, but let's just say that's kind of the that's the task of a central bank. So about a year ago, Bank of England received an additional mandate from HM Treasury, which is to promote the country's eventual transition to net zero. by 2050 or whatever this is, the official goal. So just think about, so I think that's pretty cool, right? I mean, it's very unexpected, but I think it's interesting. So here we are. This is not hypothetical. This is the reality. Right now, Bank of England has a third mandate, which is to promote the country's eventual transition to net zero. It's not something that they came up with by themselves, right? It's something that the government, their bosses essentially, well, I don't want to call them the bosses, but the mandate came from the Treasury. And from all of the speeches and research papers that I've seen in the past year, and by the way, this is not only unique to Bank of England. I've seen similar talk from the ECB, etc. From what I can tell, they have no idea how to do this, right? But they've been given the job, right? So going back to your question, well, does this create incentive? Is this lending going to be, at a low interest rate, etc.? Well, they have a job to do. Right, that job comes from, if you ask me, that's actually the right way to set things, right? It's essentially a government directive, right? Like you have to, a government of this country, whatever we may think about it, has created a direction for the country, right? Which it needs to be kind of somehow pushing itself and maybe the rest of the world towards the cleaner planet, right? It's not something that the private sector can easily do by itself. And they said, you, the central bank, will be taking charge in steering the economic activity into that direction, right? So what, other than this, can be a perfect example of how this sort of model can be actually used in real life to incentivize that movement, right? So now all of us, let's imagine the non-neutral CBDC, retail CBDC actually exists in the United Kingdom, right? The central bank has a mandate to promote essentially green economic activity. You and I, the private entities, want to participate in green economic activity, right? And here we have the central bank that helps with that, right? And we have hopefully some other government level institutions, hopefully the Treasury itself, which will be supporting that. So I think it's okay that there will be some misalignment, if you will, in rates of interest, etc., because that's the whole point. This is how you direct activity into a specific sector.
What about the second predictable criticism that the central bank, or as you rightly pointed out, HM Treasury starts picking winners? So some entrepreneurial company comes along and says, well, I've invented this slime which eats carbon. And if only you give me, £100 million, I'll be able to create a slime manufacturing factory, and we'll be able to advance towards net zero by 2040 much more quickly. How do you avoid running into those sort of John DeLorean or Theranos style criticisms that governments are picking winners in areas they know nothing about?
So ultimately, this can only happen in my view, this can only happen in areas where we see very obvious market failures. Okay, so first of all, let's separate between sort of hypothetical problems and hardcore problems. So the hardcore problem, I agree that a central bank cannot be in the business of choosing winners and losers, because the central bank is not a political institution. It's not run by elected government officials, right? They're supposed to be neutral, and they're supposed to be technocratic, just doing the job of running the financial system. So that's the hardcore problem. And I think we've already addressed that it's not really the central bank that is setting this direction and choosing winners and losers, etc. It's something that comes from higher up, right? So I think that's clear. Now, in that case, the problem becomes not hardcore, but more like softcore, which is, well, yes, the government can be wrong. Yes, the government can be malign potentially, or it can be, setting the country in the wrong direction. Let's put it this way. But that's not a hardcore problem in the sense that they can do it anyway. Is the question of the means and the tools. I just think that this is a much more effective and technologically savvy 21st century way of managing the economy. And we can, we see examples of both successful and unsuccessful steering of the economy by the government in various parts of the world. And we can first of all very credibly say that it can happen with or without CBDC, right? We don't really have CBDC anywhere in the world right now in any meaningful fashion. But if you want some examples, let's talk about, again, maybe that's not a great example, but let's say industrial capacity and real estate in China. One may wonder that, or one may argue that that's been an incorrect development policy over the past 2 decades in China. Others may argue that that's actually been the right policy because it's lifted so many people out of poverty. one way or the other, that's something that happened without CBDC, right? It's just, well, the country chooses to do something and it does it, right? It may be right, it may be wrong, but it's not really for us to decide. Another great example is post-war Japan, right? Post-war Japan employed credit guidance very effectively at first, and then it ran into trouble. So, but let's face it, Japan has become one of the world's most developed countries throughout this period, and we may criticize it for what happened in the 80s, but nevertheless, if we compare it with where it was after World War II, we may conclude that actually setting some priorities for economic direction of the country is not such a bad idea. So, but one way or the other, it happens without it. It is really something that is beyond the scope of the discussion of the CBDC. The CBDC is simply a tool to achieve something like this.
Is there a potential upside here for even for fiscal policy? Governments are quite good at raising money in taxes or borrowing money in the markets and then splurging it on an airport or a hospital or a motorway. And maybe some years after the event, the National Audit Office will write a report saying it wasn't very good value for money. Does this way of funding market failure projects, if you like, actually create the opportunity to measure the return on those investments as they much sooner than a National Audit Office report? I mean, could it improve government accountability for its spending?
Absolutely, because it creates very significant level of transparency without infringing on individual privacy. So the two core properties of our architecture of CBDC that we always talk about as advantages of our CBDC is programmability and auditability, right? Mm-hmm. One, programmability is this idea that you can actually direct funding into very specific areas of economic activity and make sure that it stays there for basically as long as it's needed. Auditability is this idea that you can, as you said, you can very clearly monitor the circulation of that money without necessarily involving the monitoring of the individuals or entities who spend the money. So it's very clear, essentially, what the created funds are doing in the economy, and that has to do both with government-style spending, which you're describing, but also going back to our discussion about things like greenwashing and green audits, etc. That is just something that comes automatically out of the box.
Mm-hmm. Now, you just mentioned programmability. Now, this is the second radical view which you have, which I said I was going to bring up a few minutes ago. So you're talking about using a CBDC to inject liquidity into specific parts of the economy, and you know that they need liquidity because you've got this funds flow data. You can see that economic activity is declining in that area. So you use a CBDC, and you can kind of pinpoint exactly where you need to inject money, if you like. And we see the central bank in China actually doing this in a way. They're airdropping renminbi into those parts of the economy most affected by, or most towns and cities most affected by COVID. I mean, this is a radical way of thinking about monetary policy. It's a radical way of thinking about CBDC. Talk about it more. Tell us more how you see it actually operating in practical terms.
Yeah. So what we mean by programmability, I think, differs quite a bit from what the profession usually means by programmability when it talks about CBDC. So traditionally, programmability, I would describe when it's being discussed in the context of CBDC, is something that I would describe as essentially contingent liabilities, right? It's delivery versus payment style scenario where, let's say, you subscribe to a journal and the money gets paid every month, or you click on something and the money goes to a person who posted a tweet or something like that. Well, it's really something that simplifies spending the money, and essentially in that respect, in my mind, it doesn't really go any further from what we already have today. Nothing prevents you from setting up a direct debit that pays for your monthly magazine subscription, right? Or nothing prevents you from setting up an automated payment to do something that simplifies your life. In our architecture, programmability means something different. It means empowering specific units of monetary value with certain behavioral traits. And in that respect, I like to compare them essentially with like cells in our body, right? Our cells know what to do by themselves. Somehow that is encoded in them at creation. And that's something that is very similar to how units of monetary values, units of monetary value in our CBDC architecture behave. They don't have to, by the way. So in our architecture, your traditional plain vanilla CBDC can exist with no programmability features, right? So in other words, you can easily issue or imagine issuing a tranche of CBDC, which acts just like regular money, right? You spend it on anything, and you don't really see any difference. But some tranches of CBDC can be issued with varying degrees of programmability, which has to do with ensuring that economic activity stays, at least for a predetermined period of time, within a given area of the economy. And in that respect, it really helps to, as you mentioned, it really helps to direct liquidity into the specific sectors of the economy where that liquidity is needed most. Now, in your description, the sectors, the areas of the economy are more like geographic areas of the economy. And there's nothing wrong with that. In our understanding, usually it has to do with conceptual areas of economic activity. Again, going back to things like green spending, etc. But there's nothing wrong with the geographical angle either.
So you could have a CBDC program that can only be spent in these postcodes.
Theoretically, yes. Theoretically, nothing prevents you from doing that. But it's very clear. It's very important to mention this. Not all of CBDC has to be like that. Some tranches of it can be like that. Yes.
So we're talking, if I was stumbling for a commonplace metaphor, you're talking, QE up to this point has been a bit of a blunderbuss. You buy all these bonds from institutional investors, the money ends up in the bank, and you hope the bank lends more money to people. What we're talking about here is actually a much more precisely targeted a rapier versus a blunderbuss. Is that a reasonable way of thinking about what you're proposing here?
I think it's a great analogy. So exactly as you described, the problem with QE is that you're really relying on the banking system or the financial market, broadly speaking, to deliver what you're trying to achieve towards the greater masses, if you will. And as we've seen, based on our experience over the past decade plus, that doesn't really work very well. It creates a lot of distortions in places where you don't necessarily want to see those distortions, where there's financial assets, real estate, etc. But it doesn't necessarily deliver extra economic activity in the areas where you actually wanted to see them. And I suppose we can't really blame central banks for having put in place so much QE over the past 10 years because they simply didn't have any other tools. But with the emergence of a tool like CBDC, the central bank would hypothetically be empowered with a much more surgically precise instrument that can help it to achieve its mandate, if you will, set by higher institutions without hopefully creating those distortions. And of course, what we're seeing in the market now, what we're seeing in the economy now, specifically in 2022, is kind of the payback for all of the side effects that the QE and other forms of stimulus have been creating over the past decade. And hopefully we can learn from that a little bit more sophisticated going forward.
I'm trying to hold in my mind these two radical views you have about, a narrower version of QE, if you like, a surgically precise delivery of liquidity to exactly where it's needed. Does this mean that we should start to think about CBDC in much broader terms, kind of move away from it being purely a monetary instrument and start to think about it more as a crucial part of some kind of national or civil or social infrastructure, which lots of different private sector actors can develop new services. They come and with ideas for borrowing money, whether it's to invest in a green project or to invest in something else. So you retain the creative energy of private companies and entrepreneurs, but it has this bedrock infrastructure of programmable central bank money, which those various entrepreneurs and private companies can start to use to create these more precise, more effective products and services, including credit for green projects or credit for parts of the economy which need rapid and precise injections of liquidity. Am I putting too much, thinking too hard about what you're proposing? Does it make sense in your mind to think about what you're proposing as a CBDC as a national, social, civil infrastructure as opposed to just central bank money?
I think you're describing it quite well, and I think you're painting a very nice looking picture. I thank you for that description. I think it describes really well how we think about CBDC and really highlights that crucial point, which is that the way we think about CBDC is that it can be a lot more than just a payment platform or a simple monetary instrument. And in that respect, our vision is very different from the kind of the mainstream discussion that takes place around a retail CBDC right now. Because to be clear, the mainstream discussion does not see CBDC as anything other than a purely neutral and mundane payment platform that is redundant to the existing payment platforms. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, our view is it is indeed radically different from that, because we think that the introduction of something like the CBDC is a generational opportunity for the central bank and for the society in general. It is something indeed that gives us the opportunity to rethink what are the core elements of our economy, and can we add an additional one that can do a lot more than simply to help us make payments. Because I'm very convinced that in the developed world, at least, the problem of payments doesn't exist anymore. It's been solved, and to put an additional solution into the space is a huge waste of opportunity. And I really hope that the existing retail CBDC debate moves beyond that, and it doesn't. It prevents us from wasting this opportunity simply on creating a mundane payment platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who would agree with you about that. In fact, we're going to be talking about that on a webinar a bit later this week. We've talked for a long time, and I must let you go in a minute. But before I do, I'd like to just go back to something more basic about central banks, which is that they are responsible, as you yourself said a few minutes ago, for financial stability. And the modern central banking methodologies, if you like, arose out of the great financial crisis back in 2007-8. A lot of the regulation emerged from the inability to work out who owed what to whom. And so the system imploded because of ignorance, really, as much as ignorance and fear rather than anything else. If we're operating in a system of the type, financial system of the type you've described, we know a lot more about who owes what to whom. We can see the flows, we can see them in real time, so we can uncover those interconnections between different members of the financial system networks much more quickly. Is that one of the benefits of the flow data-based system which you've described? Does it actually add to financial stability because we know more?
So yeah, I don't think that we would necessarily know who owes what to whom, but what we would know is exactly as you described. What we would know is the crucial fault lines in the overall liquidity picture in the banking system, in the financial market. What we've seen very clearly in the networks and models that we have uncovered, both in synthetic data and in real life data, is that these bottlenecks and these potential fault lines really reveal themselves quite well. And I think they may potentially empower any central bank with a much better understanding of the structure of the financial system and of the potential failure points or bottlenecks or fault lines within the financial system. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, I divided your world, if you like, into these two parts, the financial crime part and the CBDC part. But as I've listened to you, I've become more aware of the fact that actually it might be convenient to think of it like that, but actually these two capabilities are really ultimately one, or they can certainly work together. So you can start to use the same data set to combat financial crime, but also to improve pockets of illiquidity in the economy, to enhance financial stability, give people money if their part of the economy is damaged by COVID much more precisely, much more surgically. So would it be more sensible to think about this as really just a more complete understanding of the flows which are going on within a closed or indeed an open financial system, and therefore you can enact or make policy decisions which are more effective? Are these ultimately just different facets of a single data set which intelligent policymakers can work off? Or is it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're really talking about the same conceptual technology, which is applied slightly differently in the two different areas that you described. Mm-hmm. However, the big underlying difference is that essentially we're talking about two separate forms of money. So when it comes to the, let's say, financial crime use case and understanding the the overall banking account universe, etc. You're talking about analyzing commercial bank money, right? So it simply is, as you said, the data set on which the technology is employed. When you talk about the CBDC use case, you're talking about the not yet existent form of central bank retail digital money, right? So it's a hypothetical form of money that doesn't yet exist, but may exist should the central banks choose to implement it. And in that respect, pretty much the same or very similar technology applied to that world acts very differently. I mean, not different, acts very similarly to just a slightly different use case. Now, what prevents the same sort of CBDC style use cases in the commercial banking system space? Actually nothing. And ironically, when we first started thinking about FutureFlow, we really aimed it at the commercial banking space. However, we realized that the task, the coordination task of bringing multiple parties on the same page, etc., is humongously complex, and it's something that we will probably never see in our lifetime. That we could be wrong, but what makes this a lot easier and a lot more elegant in the world of central bank digital money is that you have one single actor, which is just the central bank, and so there's no coordination challenge. But yes, conceptually, it's the same technology.
Yeah. One final question for you. You alluded earlier to two lost years, 2020, 2021. You lost them to COVID-19. Conversations came to a halt as central banks and banks tried to work out how to use Zoom and Microsoft Teams. Are those same audiences now, and I'm talking here of central banks, maybe other regulators, also commercial banks, are they actually showing genuine interest now in what you're describing to them?
We're seeing genuine interest in the financial crime space right now. There's no doubt about that. I'm very excited about all of the developments in that space. When it comes to the CBDC part of the business, I must say that our views remain very much on the radical side of the debate right now. I must admit that the mainstream narrative in the CBDC space is still very much focused on that neutral, simple payment platform kind of level. So my impression so far is our views are a little bit too radical for most central banks that we have spoken with so far. It could change. So that remains to be seen. One thing that makes me quite hopeful, though, is that as time passes, we still haven't seen a single central bank claim with credibility that what they're doing actually serves a purpose. That's one thing that is yet to come out of any central bank that we know of that is closely studying CBDC. So I remain convinced that the conversation around a neutral payment-only CBDC concept is something that is unlikely to see a light of day, simply because the decision-making parties will continue to admit to themselves, perhaps privately, that there's no point in implementing one. And so our job is to stay around for as long as that takes place and to be there when they finally come to their senses and realize that, as you said, they have an opportunity to create a crucial element of the national infrastructure, of the national development strategy, over the national development story, and do something a lot bigger and a lot more impactful and purposeful than creating a new payment system. So we'll be waiting for them.
Vadim Sobolevski, thanks very much for taking the time to share your ideas with us.
Thank you for your patience.